So, both my parents came here from Damascus, Syria, and, they came here like 45 years ago. Actually, my parents, my mother's side migrated here in the early 60s. And that's kind of what opened the door to my family coming here. And, I was born and raised in South Philadelphia, very like old school kind of Italian neighborhood. It still is to this day. A lot of people have moved to Jersey, but, that's how it was. And it was, it was an amazing experience that taught you grit. If you've never been to Philly, Philly will teach you grit. It's a grind, it doesn't end. But having, immigrant parents, that with the combination of growing up in Philadelphia was just an amazing overall experience, because I got exposed to two different cultures, and that kind of helped shape who I am today.
That's awesome. So let's double click on that. In what way did that shape you?
Yeah. So, I mean, if anyone here has immigrant parents or knows, has friends who come from like immigrant households, immigrant parents are like, it's like no bullshit, right? It's like very strict. Like you put your head down, you work hard. Some of the values in my home was both my parents are engineers, they're electrical engineers. So it was like, hey, we worked our ass off to get to where we are, and you're gonna do the same. Like this is the only way you get things done, is no giving up, hard charging, grit. We didn't know anything about feelings. There were what are feelings? You say, hey, I feel this way. No, that's not how you feel. This is how you feel, right? And you just hard charge into it.
We'll tell you how you feel.
Exactly. And so, you grow up with these set of parameters that they kind of grew up with, and they transfer that to you. But then you go out into the other world, right? Growing up as an American and in the US, and you're like, no, life is about this way, and you should chase your dreams and your passions and this. And you go back and tell your immigrant parents, they're like, what do you mean dreams and passions? Like your dream and passion is to work hard. You go to school, you become educated, you do this, and this is you get married, you have kids, and those are your dreams and passions. Yeah. And it's like very conflicting ideologies. And I think it takes, maturity to be able to navigate between both worlds and kind of extract the value from each one of those. Yeah. Right. Because there is value in both ways of living.
Yeah. You have to adapt. You have to adapt to what's going on inside your house, and then to what's going on outside, and essentially bridge the gap between the two. Yeah. So how did, so how did that pressure from the parents and then, the outside influence kind of affect how you grew up?
Yeah, I mean, so the pressure was good in terms of like, resilience is definitely one of my strongest core values, and it's actually led to most of my success. But that being said, hard work, resilience, I was able to take that from my family. I remember one time, and this is very comical. I was outside, and it was snowing, and I maybe I was like 10 or 11 or 12 years old. I can't remember the exact age. And, my dad, we had a corner house in South Philly, and he had to shovel the whole thing. So he asked me to come out and help him. Right. And I go, and it's a big property. Right. So I'm shoveling, and I remember halfway through, I got really tired. It was hard. And I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And he looked at me and he said, I'm raising bitches, or am I raising men? And I was just like, whoa. And I felt like it was just like so serious. Like, hey, I'm raising men. I'm raising people who don't give up. Like, don't give me that whiny stuff that you hear at school or with your other friends. That doesn't belong in this home. Right. And a part of me was like, man, why did I give up? Like, I started questioning, like, why didn't I not want to do it? And then I asked him a question. I said, well, don't you ever want to give up? And he says, every day, but I never do.
Yeah.
And he was like, and that's how we were raised, that we don't stop. Even if it feels uncomfortable, you just keep going. And so it's funny because I've taken that now and I apply that to my kids.
Yeah.
Right. It's become a part of like my mantra in life, and I apply it to my children. On the other side, one of the things that I felt like was a disvalue to me is understanding what I was feeling inside. right? So there was never any questions about what's going on inside and how to feel. So what ends up happening is you just push these feelings down, and they eventually turn into something. And so when I was a teenager, they turned into anger. And then I became an angry teenager, right? But that was just pent up feelings that I didn't know how to express. And so as I got older and I learned more about like expressing my feelings, and mind you, I still do this work to this day, right? It helps me navigate like, oh, this is why I'm feeling this way. So I think the value of being able to kind of bridge both together is amazing. And I do that with my children, right? I push them so that they're strong and resilient, but at the same time, I value their feelings and I acknowledge what they're feeling. And I tell them like, that's a human experience. Of course you're going to feel that way. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I value that you feel that way, and nobody's ever going to displace your feelings. And it's funny, when my parents come to my house sometimes, they'll still displace my kids' feelings. And I'm so conscious to it. I'm like, whoa, 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 slow down. And I'm like, don't say that to them. This is how they're feeling. They're telling you. Okay. So let's just listen and appreciate it.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I mean, the unfortunate thing is that they themselves didn't get a chance to actually understand kind of how to navigate or how to communicate feelings, how to explain what that emotional state, and how to give tools to they weren't given tools to deal with that emotion. And so I think that's kind of every generation does its best, essentially, if you will.
But you know what? It's amazing though, because some of the things that you get from that culture, and one of the things that I think about this, and I hope it never happens, is the dilution of the cultural values, right? Because a lot of these cultures, whether it's Indian, Asian, African, wherever you come from, European, those cultures have been built for thousands of years, right? And if you look at America as a whole, it's a new culture, right? It's shifting. If you look 40, 50 years ago, it was different than it is today. But if you look at these other cultures, those cultures have been in the same kind of capacity for thousands of years, right? So if you take that, something has been working. So you don't want to dilute that and lose it, because there's significance there, right? But where it becomes amazing is when you're able to take that and then add on to it, layer on certain things, right? So, and I think that's the key, is a lot of parents or people want to fight certain cultures, right? I don't want to be that. And I'm like, but there's so much value there. Like, like take the value, write down what these things that you took that could have been extracted from that culture, and then take the things from this culture and what was extracted there and kind of blend it together. And you get almost like a superhuman, right? Because eventually the way I see kind of the US going as an American culture is it's going to keep shifting, and eventually it's going to land somewhere, and it's going to land somewhere that these people have already figured out.
Yes. Well, sometimes you experiment and you end up in the same spot. I mean, I think it's not a bad thing to experiment. The challenge is that sometimes people take these experiments as fact or as the new way, and it's just a fad, it's just a trend. But if a person absorbs that trend that's not the right trend, they can affect their family legacy for generations. So,
and then there's a lot of regret. They'll look back, they'll be like, man, I did this as a kid because that was the thing to do. And then they look back, they were like, that wasn't, because again, it's like trial and error. So I think there's so much value in looking at other, and I do this all the time, and not only in culture, I do it for health, right? Because there are different Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine. There's all these different medicine, even though people are like, no, Western medicine, and that's it. No, that's not true. Western medicine is very valuable, but so are other cultural modalities, right? So the same thing goes to cultures. There's so much value in looking at how different cultures raise their kids, and looking at the kind of overlap that you see in so many different cultures. There must be some significance there.
Yeah, I mean, well, the simplest thing is just food. You see these old cultures that have figured out food, what works for them, what's the healthy thing. And, we come in and we say, oh, okay, well, let's just we invented this hot pocket thing. Now we're on the hot pocket diet, and it takes us about 10, 15, 20 years to figure out, oh, that stuff kills you.
Yep.
And maybe we should have gone back to the simple vinaigrette and the salad and a piece of fish. That's kind of like the old Mediterranean diet. So I think that's kind of like the issues, that these trends come in so fast and so furious, and there's so much money and advertising behind them. There's so much marketing. There's so much, and then people absorb these phenomena, and then now everybody follows the herd, and then all of a sudden you have a generation of people that are addicted to
processed food,
energy drinks, or processed food, or like frozen meals and the microwave meals, and they got all these plastics and all these chemicals in them.
Again, this has become a cultural thing, right? And then you'll see it like what it was 30 or 40 years ago and where it's now. It's shifted, and it's going to keep shifting, right? But if you look at other cultures, like one mealtime was you don't eat alone, you eat with family, right? And I've seen this over numerous cultures where they all get together. Why? Because your digestion is actually optimized when you're in your parasympathetic state. So you're relaxed, you're with family, you're laughing, you're communicating, you're joking, you're eating slow. Versus in the US, it's like, I got to work. I got to chow down this food and get back to work, where it's not very conducive. You can only do that for so long before it catches up to you. And then the next thing you know, you're like, hey, man, I got digestion issues, or I can't eat that food, or, hey, I'm going to go carnivore because I can't eat this. Stress causes gut dysbiosis and so many other things. So, there is so much value in just looking at other cultures and seeing what they've been doing instead of rejecting it, being more appreciative of it, because we all collectively in the US, and this is one of the things that I also realized growing up, is everybody in the US is from a different culture, and they've all kind of pieced it together, and they're like, hey, let's create a new culture. But in actuality, you're just going to land somewhere where those cultures were initially anyway.
Yeah, and also because of that, because we're all come from a different place, there's a different genetic code that had adapted for thousands of years in a certain environment with a certain diet, with certain agriculture in that area, and now you transport it to this area, so you have like a mix of people that are trying to do the same thing. Culturally, they're bombarded with advertising and marketing, and they're copying each other and the same thing. But what works with one does not work. If I'm from North Africa and you're originally from, you have the roots in the Middle East, and someone else is in Russia and someone else is in Korea, we're going to adapt. We're going to react differently to different things.
That's right.
And
if you've been eating a certain thing for thousands of years, it works for you, right? Genetically, there was some adaptation there.
Yeah. So we end up, I want to go back one step, just to go back to the parenting loop. So what are some of the things that you think your parents did well, and what are some of the things they didn't do well? You gave us a couple, but give us another.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, there was a very dynamic balance in my household. My dad, because he came from the Middle East, he always felt like he needed to be the dominant one. But my dad's not a dominant guy. He's a very passive, loving, easygoing, wanted to just make sure my mom was always happy. But he was told as a kid, again, hey, you have to be, the man, and you have to be this way, and you have to be this way. And I think he tried to be it, but it wasn't who he was at his core. And so my mom, the other way around, she was like, oh, you're supposed to be more, catering towards your husband, or passive, or, nurturing in this. And my mom's like a hard charger, entrepreneur, direct, like go after it, doesn't stop. And so it was a very interesting dynamic, because I got to see my mom was more in a dominant position, and my dad was kind of more chill and laid back. And so some of the things that I kind of picked up without them telling me was, okay, women are not as chill as people say. So I used to hear people be like, oh, Middle Eastern women are so like passive and this. And I'm like, where? Not in my house. It's not like that. Like, I've never met someone like that. And then it'd be like, oh, Middle Eastern men are extremely dominant. And I'm like, not in my house, so that was one of the things, right? So then I realized that I was like, okay, which one do I like more? And so I kind of found like my happy medium where I think there's value in being dominant in what you're strong at and being passive at the things that you're not so strong at. The other thing is education was, I would say that was like our number one core value was education. The other thing was resilience. We weren't allowed to give up on anything. The other thing that was extremely important was tolerance to other cultures. You know, like that was a big deal in my house. Like my dad and mom, like I would see my dad go out and help people. Like we lived on a corner house, so you see accidents happen or flat tires. He would just run out there and try to help everybody. He'd tell me to come with him. Hey, come on, we're going to help those people. And I'm like, we don't know those people. And he was like, dude, he was like, you have to help as many people in the world as possible.
That's
so
awesome.
You know, we would go down Center City every single day. We would feed like homeless people. It was, you know, it was incredible because they never said that like you have to do it, but he said, hey, listen, we have to give back because we have, right? We've been given an opportunity. So that was a big, big deal in our house. So I would say I picked that up, that the education, not to give up. And those are, and the family values, right? Like even when times were hard between my parents, where you would see all these other people getting divorced, you know, and I would just be like, I would say to my parents, maybe you two shouldn't be together, you know, and they would be like, listen, life, they had a saying that even your intestines fight with each other, you know, like,
Sure.
you know, so it's like, no matter where you are, who you are, you're always going to have, you know, conflict.
Yeah.
The difference between people who make it through and don't are the ones who keep going. And you know, they've been married for over 45 years. So they've been in this country for more than 45 years, almost 47 years.
Wow.
And so, you know, that being said, like, it was like, hey, you just don't give up, you know, whether it's on your relationship, your family, like, you know, it's always going to be okay. Like you have to stick by each other. Blood is so important. And, you know, even if, and so now let's add the other part to it, right? Because I have a second set of family. My best friend Isaac's family, Sue and Hector Badeau, and they adopted 20 children. And I lived with them for 5 years, right?
Wow.
So that was a huge influence in my life because I realized that family doesn't just mean blood. It's also, there's so much more to it, right?
Yeah.
And so I learned so much just living with them. So I think, you know, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. What are
just off
some of the things
top
that
of
you learned from the second family
Oh man,
that you
dude.
take
Well,
with you in raising your kids?
Oh, so I would say that was the real bridge between both worlds, right?
Okay.
Living with them because number one, extremely emotionally intelligent. You know, they valued emotion, they valued you know, feelings. There was a constant conversation. Number two, family meetings. They used to execute family meetings, and you had one-on-one time with the dad where he would sit down and kind of talk about your goals and how to achieve those goals and what are your roadblocks. The other thing is support. No matter what you wanted to do, they were very supportive. There wasn't any, you have to be like in my family, my parents that came from the Middle East, it was like doctor, lawyer, engineer, done. You know, there's nothing else that exists in the world versus, you know, with Isaac's family, the Badeaux, there was more support in like what you love to do. You know, there's value there. And then there was one thing that really kind of stuck with me is when you adopt 20 kids, right? Again, so one of the things that match is they both wanted to give back. My parents would give back. They would help people. People would be allowed to stay at our house. They would, you know, go out and try to give food or services. And mind you, they're still that way to this day, right? They live their life. My dad loves to help people. But the Badeaux as well, they started off the adoption agency and they would fall in love with these children and they would adopt them themselves when they wouldn't get adopted. So they ended up with 20 kids. Now, when you adopt 20 kids, they come from all different cultures.
Yeah.
So we used to have Sunday dinner, and during Sunday dinner, we would celebrate whoever's culture was going on that week. or that month. So if it was Black History Month, it was, that was the focus. If it was Rosh Hashanah, that was the focus. If it was Kwanzaa, that was the focus.
Yeah.
If it was Ramadan, that was the focus. And whatever, culture or religion your roots came from, that was celebrated. So these kids were super tolerant. They were Asian, Indian, white, Hispanic, Black, like a whole mix of adopted kids that they were all brothers and sisters. So it was one of the most fascinating kind of experiences to grow up in, because you're like United Nations in one home, right?
Yeah. And it's cool because it gives them that sense of identity, even though they're all different.
Yep.
It's that unity of family, that unity of appreciation of cultures. It gives them that sense of belonging. It's cool. So what do you think the two families should have done? What are some of the things that their blind spots, if you will?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. If I were to start with the Bedeaus, I would say that their biggest blind spot, and I've spoken to them about this actually, I said, if you were to do something differently, what would you do? And I think they weren't as strict about pushing their kids towards education and really dialing in and making that like a hard core pillar of their life. Right. So you have a lot of different levels in the family, people who went to school, people who dropped out, people who are like grad school, people who are CEOs, people who, didn't make it at all. And I think when I spoke to them, I think that would be one thing that if they were to really hyper focus is to push those kids.
Yeah.
On the flip side, my parents did an amazing job with that.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I would say their biggest blind spot was the emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Right. How do your kids feel? Like we were all raised to kind of put our emotions aside and push them down. Yeah. And then eventually they all popped up, but they all popped up different for each one of us.
Yeah.
And so I think, that's where I was able to take from the Bedeaus and then take from my parents. I'm like, hey, education, hard charging, resilience, but feelings and this. And I was able to kind of blend both worlds together, which again, my kids are young. So I don't know how they're going to turn out. Right. We'll see.
Yeah.
But I think I'm doing a good job. I feel like I'm doing a good job.
Got it. So essentially you took the best of both worlds, and I have to give grace to your parents because obviously they're immigrants, they're surviving, they're trying to do their best, work a lot, do what they have to raise kids. And so sometimes the emotional feeling side takes a lot more time that they don't have. Yep. They're just trying to feed you and try to get you to school or get you to go to school or get you to get dressed. And then, so I can appreciate, I can empathize, and you can see even with people that are not from any other culture, just people that are still in the thick of it, that are grinding. It's sometimes they have a hard time stopping to have a long conversation about big feelings.
Right. Well, sometimes they don't understand the value of it, right? So because they weren't brought up that way.
Yeah.
And you're right. They were just trying to survive, right? So they didn't see the value in that. It was more direct feedback. Let's just go get dressed. We have to leave.
Yeah.
Right. Versus hey, what's going on today? You're not yourself, right?
Yeah.
That would have taken more energy to have those conversations, and they weren't ready for it at that time. So you're right.
So now with your kids, what is your goal? What is your plan? What is your vision? What's the general
well,
idea?
thanks to you, I was able to switch them into homeschooling, which is, I didn't understand the value of it. I kept hearing it, right? But, you hear it and there's this kind of stigmatism behind it where people kind of downplay it. They think it's weird.
Yeah.
And I think that shifted a lot after COVID, right? Has it been a significant shift? And I think it's not because of COVID. I think really what shifted it was the birth of the internet, because connection became much easier to find groups and connect with other people versus, before people would say, oh, homeschoolers, they're antisocial.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that at all, because I think there are kids who are extroverted and there's kids who are introverted naturally. And, you know, if they're naturally extroverted, you could keep them hidden away. The moment you let them loose, they're just going to be extroverted.
Yeah.
Right. And if they're introverted, no matter how much you've put them, how many people do we both know that are introverted, that went to public school and are still introverted, and they're in their 40s, right? Like, so obviously that social statistic isn't actually accurate, right? Because then that would mean every introvert is actually now an extrovert because they went to public school.
Yeah.
So I would say that the biggest shift was the homeschooling. And, you know, because one, as an entrepreneur, as someone who believes in health, as someone who believes in, you know, raising your kids to have less traumas in their life, so that they have cleaner souls, is they need to be in a safer environment. And when I say safer environment, is we as parents have a responsibility. We brought these kids into this world, and sometimes what we end up doing is we pass them along to other people.
Yeah.
And we don't really know who those people are, right? So they're going and they have a different teacher every year, sometimes multiple teachers, multiple kids in the school, which we don't really know what's going on in those kids' homes. And they're now being influenced by those teachers, those kids, and they come back to us, and then we try to put in a little bit, right? Like 2 to 3 hours a day. But in actuality, if you actually thought about it, I don't know many families that would be okay with that. Yeah. They would say, no, I want to put more into my kid. And so I think a lot of parents, these kids get to a certain level, whether they're teenage years or older, and they look back and they're like, man, I wish I had more time, or I wish I'd put more value into my kids. So going back to your question is, what am I focused on? Well, number one is I'm focused on spending time with my family, you know, with my kids. And I think that's been one of the biggest pivots in the homeschooling, is that they get to hang around us and we get to hang around them. And now it's not just, hey, family's important, but we actually show them by example, right? So that's one of the big things. Number two is health is extremely important to me. And, you know, in schools, they feed them trash. They allow trash to come in, and everyone's doing it, so it's okay, right? Everyone smokes cigarettes. It's okay to smoke cigarettes. Everyone drinks. It's okay to drink. So everyone eats trash or processed foods or these things that cause problems. It's okay, but it's not okay. Yeah. And I think somebody, you know, a lot of people are afraid to kind of stand up to that. And I think nowadays we're seeing a little bit of that shift in the political side of things, right? Which I'm happy about. But that being said, when you can control that environment and teach your kids why health is important, what real health means, right? What we put into our body is how important that is. That's been a huge shift with my kids. Because when I used to say, hey, we're not going to do any added sugar or any sugar in our house or processed food, I would always get backlash, because they go to school and then they come home and it's like they see one thing, they come. Now, because that's all they're around, it was great. 2-3 weeks ago, we went out to a restaurant, and, you know, my kids, they're so used to eating clean. And meaning clean, like lots of fruits, lots of vegetables. We don't do any seed oils. It's, you know, olive oil, you know, very like grass-fed meats. And everything, we don't do any bread or pasta. You know, rice is, you know, glyphosate free and it's clean. And so everything is very like calculated in the home. Yeah. And when your body gets used to eating that way, and then you go out and you eat a different way, your body tells you. Yeah. You know? And so as soon as we get done out the restaurant, my son's like, man, I feel tired. Yeah. This is weird. I'm like, what do you mean? He was like, normally when I eat, I feel like I have all this energy, and now I just want to go to sleep. And I said, that, my friend, is inflammation. Yeah. You know, and I was like, you've just eaten something that wasn't actually good for your body. Now, the problem is most people don't understand that. Their body's in inflammation all the time. Yeah. So they're just used to that feeling. Yeah. But when a kid at the age of 8 can recognize that, I was like, oh man, this is great. Like, you know, this kid, he's already starting to pick up on the value of health. Yeah. And so, so being able to instill health, you know, our personal values, grit, how we deal with people, you know, how they relationships with adults, how we communicate, how my wife and I communicate with each other, you know, because we have a very solid marriage, and, you know, just helping others. Like we get to put all this stuff into these kids and good morals. And, you know, it's just been one of the best experiences of my life. So I do want to thank you for that, Jay.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm happy to help. So in terms of health, what are some of the other things aside from, you know, keeping, which is very important, keeping the environment clean, you know, making sure that everything that we bring into the house is, you know, nutritious and clean, keeping, you know, the going out, you know, under control. What are some of the other elements that you've implemented with your kids, or how do you teach them where, you know, eventually when they're, you know, young adults or they're adults leaving the house, they're going to keep those habits and those routines? What are you teaching them to stay healthy?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So health is obviously physical, mental, and spiritual, right?
Yeah.
So there's three components to health, and each one of them is just as important as the other. So what I did was, because they're homeschooled, we have lunch together every day. We have dinner together every day. And so during lunch, what I did was I created a 52-week curriculum. And what I did is I broke it down, and I used obviously ChatGPT for this to help me. And I created basically a curriculum around diet, exercise, toxins, stress, spiritual living. And what I did was, now within each one of those, there's a lot, right? When you're talking about diet, it's like, you know, understanding macros, understanding micronutrients, understanding nutrition labels, and just so on, right? And then where food comes from and everything. So what I do is every week we tackle a topic, you know, and it could be, you know, physical. I think this week we're covering grit and resilience, right? And so that's more mental. Last week we covered gratitude, right? And what that means in terms of health is being appreciative of everything we have and not being so stuck on, you know, our own expectations of things.
Yeah.
That there's value in sometimes things don't go our way. There's value in that. So I run through this with them every week. We sit down and we cover that one topic, and I break it into segments for like 3 or 4 days, and we just keep talking about it. Now, what they don't realize is they've become little health machines.
Yeah.
You know, and like when they see things that other kids do, or when we go to a supermarket, they used to go towards certain things that they don't go towards anymore.
Yeah.
You know, and they'll be like, oh, this one's good. You know, I like this one makes me feel good. This one's this. Look at the nutrition label, the 520 rule, right? And so they understand health in a very different light. And this is, you know, we're talking about 1 year into homeschooling.
Yeah.
Can you imagine once we get into like when they're 8 and 10?
Yeah.
Imagine when they're actually like 14, 16, 18.
Yeah.
I tell my kids, I'm like, you guys are going to be like little doctors by the time you graduate high school, right? Like you're going to know so much, and this will carry you through life, and I'll feel better. Not only did I teach you about resilience, education, but I told you about health. And without health, you're never going to achieve good business. You're never going to achieve good family. You're never going to achieve the things that you really want in life. And people take health for granted. And unfortunately, the society we live in now is like, it's more patch and play instead of treat and cure.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, oh, I'm sick. Here, take this pill. We'll patch you up, you know, and it's horrible.
It is. And I mean, and the kids will absorb a lot of that content over time, and it compounds, and they remember everything, and they'll connect the dots, which is amazing. The consistency is essentially the key element there. So as you set that schedule, you said you do this for lunch. So what do you do for dinner? What's the program for dinner?
So for dinner, it's business. We talk about money. We talk about money.
So lunch is health talk, and then dinner is business talk.
Okay. And then my wife covers all the rest of the curriculum, right? With the math, the writing, the ELA, We do public speaking, we do etiquette, we do manners. They learn languages, so they're fluent in Arabic and Spanish and English, obviously, and so we just layer in other things. And like, for instance, they have an art class, but it doesn't necessarily have to be art. So for the last month and a half, they've been focused on magic.
Yes,
it's awesome.
Cool.
It's been great because they actually performed twice in situations where they would have normally been shy, but this was a great, kind of bridge to opening up to talking to people.
Yeah.
And so you get to kind of discover where their true talents are.
Yeah.
Like my son, he's obsessed with the body, right? He loves the health. So he sits down and we have all these doctor books, and he just sits there and reads about the endocrine system.
Nice.
Like some kids like to play with Legos and build out stuff. He sits there and reads about the body. He's like, Dad, like when this is the parathyroid, I'm like, dude, that's crazy. Like, I know it. There are adults that don't know anything about this world.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because they're homeschooling. We get to kind of explore what they really love to do, and now I get to push them in that direction. Like, hey, like, tell me more. Let's learn. So business, though, the reason why I teach them business is because I tell them, if I teach you how to take care of yourself, and I teach you how to make money, I never have to worry.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can take a skill set that you have and you can monetize it. And as long as you provide value to others, you'll never be starving.
Yeah.
And so we talk about business, we talk about how to monetize things, how to monetize a skill, why it's important to develop certain skills. And this is why we don't give up, because when you keep working at something and you develop a certain level of skills and you keep at it, now you become niched.
Yeah.
And that niche that you have, other people want.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people, and I tell them, I said, this is the TikTok age or the social media age that we don't, subscribe to, but they're so fast to pivot. One thing, next, tired, next. And so you look at these kids and they hit high school or they get done high school. It's like, hey, what are your skill sets? Yeah. And they don't even know. Nobody's even asked them this question. They're so lost.
They're lost.
So they're lost. And so they've had all these years to develop skills and they haven't.
Yeah.
And then they go to college and they want to start working on their first skill set. Oh, I'm going to school for accounting.
Yeah.
Like, dude, you could have worked on accounting when you were 8, 9, 10. Like, you could be working on your 4th or 5th degree right now.
Yeah.
By the time you get to college. So, that's one of the things that I think is fascinating to see.
Yeah. Value creation, monetization, understanding how the cycles of business, the cycles of the economy, they're all good skills to teach. I think one of the things, what you mentioned around, kids not knowing what they want to do in college is a lot of times they're not taught, how to identify their strengths, their tendencies, what they're good at, how to navigate those strengths and tendencies towards something that's going to be needed by the world, that's going to be, that the world will pay for, and that's going to fulfill them at the end. And I think that's kind of like the unfortunate thing, is that majority of kids just are left alone to figure it out. And then you have all these influences from everywhere telling them about these shiny things, look over here, look over there. And they're not really directed or just given the options, what the options that they're gonna shine at, what's gonna allow them to succeed in life. So I wish the whole Ikigai concept is taught as soon as possible and help kids find out what their thing is, so they can channel that energy toward it. Because you could see when kids find that thing, they just go all in. They get motivated, they get excited.
Crazy.
Yes.
Well, and a lot of that isn't. It's the person who's overseeing the kid. Like, if they're going to public school, that teacher has 20 to 30 students.
Yeah.
What are they going to focus on, right? Unless it's like completely obvious what this kid is good at, and it falls within the parameters of the school system.
Yeah.
They're not going to know. The teacher themselves probably don't even know. They were like, oh, I just did this because I didn't know what else to do in my life.
there. Yeah.
You know, and then parents, you know, this is really where it falls back on parents. If they see their kids and they start seeing it, and the problem is because sometimes they're not as creative. So if they see their kid doing something that doesn't also fall within the parameters of school, right? They're like, oh, well, that's more of a hobby. That's not going to be something you can do in life, right? So, but in actuality, it's like the question shouldn't be that. The question should be like, how can I turn this into something that they could monetize, or a skill set that they could offer people in the future? And so when we talk about business at night at the dinner table, and mind you, these conversations are like, you know, 15 minutes. And it's more just to open up their minds and their pathways to creativity and different things. And so when we talk about those things, I get to see inside their mind, you know, like, how can you turn, like my daughter was, she loves animals. If anything, I would say 100% she's going to do something in the animal field. And she's obsessed with this. She could do this all day long. And she started going around and walking people's dogs for free. Right. And not just because she wants to be around the dog. And then one of the things that she didn't like was that she had to pick up the poop. You know, and she's just like, well, I don't want to pick up poop. Right. So she went home and she's created a little pooper scooper. You know, and she was just like, oh, this is way better because now I don't have to touch it. Right. And so it's this little device. She cut up like cups and put it in with a stick and like tied it up, and then, you know, added a little apparatus where, you know, it kind of just snaps and picks it up, and then and there's a bag. So it wraps the bag around it. And it took her, you know, a few hours, but she solved the problem. And so like, I was like, this is amazing. Now, and then she went around and she said, hey, now, and she goes and tells the neighbors, hey, you don't have to pick up poop anymore. I created this. I'll make you one. Right. And I looked at her, I was like, you know, that's how businesses are born. You know, from these ideas. And so you solve a problem, you create it, right? You start manufacture it at long sale. You see if it's actually something that people want. You know, and then once you see that people want it, you start manufacturing it and you start marketing it, and then more and more people. And next thing you know, you have a business. You know, and so it's amazing to kind of see that progression. But where a lot of parents might be like, oh, that's dumb, or don't do that's already been created, you know, and they start shutting those ideas down. And what you're doing is you're really kind of pigeonholing those kids' creativity, where it doesn't matter if it was already created, and it's not dumb, and you let them do it. And it's amazing because now their creative juices start flowing, and they start discovering other things, and who knows where that's going to land. We haven't even touched the surface. We haven't scratched the surface with AI. But our kids are going to grow up in that world. So they're going to be able to create some really cool things that we can't even fathom yet.
No, absolutely. So, so speaking of AI and speaking of, you know, how AI is going to change our world, I'm always thinking, you know, are certain jobs AI safe? So you've been a pharmacist, you've owned pharmacies, and then you're a functional health, you know, advisor, consultant, coach. So are those, let's talk about pharmacy first. Is pharmacy as a job, can it be displaced by AI?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? So I always look at, you know, you have products and you have services, right? So pharmacy was a product business, and functional medicine is a service-based business, right? Very different worlds, right? I think AI is going to come in and it is going to displace a lot of jobs. Now, products, though, it can't displace products because people want products, right? They need a home, they need items, they need things to survive, right?
They need the drugs.
They need drugs. So in that regard, the pharmacy world may not be, you know, obsolete, but maybe the pharmacist side of things might become obsolete at some point, right? And how that would happen, not sure, right? It's the same thing as a doctor or a physician. You know, that's a service-based job. Who knows, in 10 or 20 or 30 years, you go into you know, a center or clinic and they say, okay, put your finger here, and they take a sample and they're like, you go in because you're sick, and it says, hey, you're dealing with, you know, influenza A. Here's what medication is going to work for you, blah, blah, blah. go to this pharmacy and pick it up, right? Who
Yeah.
knows, right?
Yeah.
But I will say one thing. Humans thrive in connection.
Yeah.
And, you know, as much as AI can come in and substitute a lot of service-based jobs, you know, sometimes like in the functional medicine side and even in pharmacy, just so you know, people at one point, I'm not sure if this statistic is still as accurate, but people trusted their pharmacist more than they trusted their doctor. They would go to their pharmacist before they would go to their doctor.
Yeah.
And you know, you would know this in a lot of other cultures. Pharmacists are the doctor.
Yeah.
You know, they go to their pharmacy and they get medication, and they only go to a physician in like dire necessities.
Right.
So the pharmacist comes in and they help them kind of navigate what's going on. They help kind of understand the big picture, and they give them the medication that could be the most helpful for them. On the functional side, and that, by the way, that was the side I loved in pharmacy, right? Connecting with my patients and helping them kind of navigate and understand their family history and their dynamic and what's getting them to this point, and finding kind of the root cause of a lot of their ailments. And then you take the functional medicine side, right? It's really preventing a lot of the issues from ever even getting to the pharmacy. Right? Like, what are the choices we can make and changes that we can make? So yes, a AI platform could potentially tell you those things, right? They do genetic testing and all that. But who is going to hold your hand through the process? Who's going to make those adjustments? Who's going to have that conversation and that connection with you? So, you know, maybe generations down, that might not be as valuable. But right now, it's still valuable. So I don't know where it's going to land. And just like everything else in business, and you know this, Jay, you start one way and you pivot and you pivot and you pivot and you look back 10 years, man, I started my business here, but I'm all the way over here now. It's completely different. So you just pivot. And that's just the way life is.
So if Zaid comes to you tomorrow and says, "Hey, Dad, I want to be a pharmacist," what would your advice be? Like, how would he go about doing it?
Yeah, so the first question I would ask him is why, right? Like, what is your motivation behind it? Because, you know, pharmacy is not really one of those jobs that people kind of wish they were doing. You know, like from a young age, I can't wait to be a pharmacist. You know, there are some jobs that people want to do, but mostly you hear doctor, right? And doctor falls under so many different, you know, segments. So you have pharmacy, you have dentist, you have surgery, you have family medicine, and it goes on, right? So when we say doctor, and my son, you know, Adrian Zaid, does say, I want to be a doctor, right? And so it's like, okay, what kind, right? Let's talk about why. So if he said, I want to be a pharmacist, I would ask him why. And I personally would discourage it, you know, just because I feel like that he has more potential that he can go towards and make a bigger impact in life. And, you know, sometimes pharmacists, and I believe this is true to be a lot with pharmacists a lot. I've met some really, really dynamic and incredibly intelligent people who've gone into pharmacy and just didn't understand their true potential. And they get stuck working behind, they call it behind the bench, and just filling prescriptions. And, you know, their soul gets sapped, you know, and because they've traded their time for money. You know, and whatever that dollar is, 150,000 a year. And, you know, and I feel like they could have made such a bigger impact, but they didn't have that understanding of who they are inside. So I would, if he wants to study pharmacy just for knowledge, by all means, go for it. But if he says like, oh, you know, that's where my calling is, I'd be like, okay, that's where you're calling. I'm not going to argue that, but I think you have way more potential. And my job right now is to get him to see that potential.
So where would you redirect him to? Like, what would be
the bigger impact?
Or like what would be the field that you would send him to or direct him to?
Well, if I was going to actually take my son now, is
let's go with that example.
okay.
Yes,
So
that's better.
one of the things I see that he is extremely talented in is sports. He's
Okay.
naturally very, very athletic. He picks up on things very quick, but he's also brilliant when it comes to like science and understanding the body and internally and externally. So him and I have been talking about this a lot, right? He was just like, Dad, I love this and I want to be a doctor in this. And I said, well, you know, how could you blend both worlds together, right? So there is, I would say, like maybe an undergrad degree in like kinesiology, right? And then kind of building on that to see where he falls, because there are so many different modalities he could do. He might, you know, end up getting a PhD in a certain area of expertise in medicine or in kinesiology, or becoming a sports commentator, right? Or a sports medicine doctor, or something along the lines of like, but I do want him to live a life where he's extremely passionate about what he does. I don't want to put my kind of ideologies on him, because I don't really have an ideology for him. I just want him to do what he loves to do, and I want it to feel light every time he does it.
Yeah, you're trying to maximize his kind of God-given talents, if you will. You know, so he's got his own talents, he's got his own tendencies, he's got his own, you know, things that bring him joy, and then so if you can channel that to the maximum potential with those ingredients, I think that's the best way to do it. Yeah, it makes complete sense.
And he loves connection with people, you know, and he loves to help people. So like if we can bring those things, and again, every time I see one of these like skill sets in one of my kids, I write it down.
So how would you go coach him to get there? Like what would be his like to-do list, or what is the, you know, year 1, year 2, year 5?
Yeah, great question. So here's what I did. We wrote down, I have the list, a journal of every skill set that my kids kind of navigate towards, their tendencies, right?
Yeah.
And so what I do is I said, hey, okay, you're naturally, like, let's take him, for instance, you love people, you love connection, you love helping people, you love the body and health, and you love sports.
Yeah.
So I was like, let's create quarterly goals, okay? So that you get to dive into those worlds and see what you love more. So I got him a series of doctor books, right? And then every day he reads them. We talk about series of sports books, series of like on how you can maximize communication with people, you know. And so what we do is we try to bring these things, and I try to build on those skill sets. Now, some of them are going to feel lighter than others.
Yeah.
And so once I see that, I say, how do you like that? Oh, I'm fascinated by this, or, you know, it's okay.
Yeah.
You know, and so then I start kind of refining it. And my goal isn't for him to get to the point where he gets to college and he goes to school for it. No, I want him to feel like he's an expert by the time he finishes high school.
Yeah.
You know, like by the time these kids hit high school, they should already know what they're going to be doing for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
It's not by college.
Right.
By the time they get to college, now we're refining. They've already built the skill set.
Yeah.
College is like, hey, I'm going to dive even deeper.
Yeah.
And then, you know, it becomes so they're already way ahead of most people.
Yeah. College is just to complement and add the label, you know, whatever that label is that's going to necessary to be able to, or the certificate that's necessary so they can access the next thing.
And you may not even need it depending on what your choice in life is, right?
Yeah.
If you're like a tech person or an entrepreneur,
yeah,
sometimes these people have developed businesses out before they even got to college.
Correct.
You know, so like what college can almost become a hindrance at that point.
Yes.
You know, like you go network and you go to meetups and you go to these courses or whatever, and that actually beats going to college because you have now experience.